Welcome to The View From Here. I'm Kimberly Olsen. These talks that I give are often given straight off the cuff. And that's the way I tend to think and work. I have a long history of talking on panels, a long history of public speaking, a long history of consulting with C-suite leaders. I'm used to having to speak from the cuff, openly, honestly, and with authenticity. One of my most favourite leaders in all the world, probably the best leader I've encountered in 40 years of work, was a woman by the name of Lana Richards. Sorry to embarrass you, Lana, but she will know that this is the way that I work, that my best thinking is done when I'm actively speaking and thinking. Hi to Lana, I miss you dearly, and I look forward to one day reconnecting with you. There's a kind of a misunderstanding in organizations that are robustly concerned with the ways of working that they've known all along, the ways that they protect their intellectual property, the ways that they protect their power structures, and the disconnect between that and understanding how to actually deliver inclusion. Because one of the things that health organizations you think would understand really well, that profess to understand really well but don't understand at all, is how you deliver cultural safety for your employees rather than for your clients. I think they understand how to do it for clients, and not to say that they do it, but they understand how. And one of the things is that starts with what I call humility, cultural humility. And I want to talk more generally about humility in inclusion, because the big piece that's missing today in terms of understanding diverse lived experience is humility. It seems in this day and age that it's impossible to have an open and honest, authentic conversation with somebody whose opinion differs from yours at a personal level and at a corporate level. And corporations will take action to protect themselves from what they perceive to be threats to their power structures. And in actual fact, what they need is to disassemble their power structures in order to build a diverse and inclusive organization. Now, I don't mean go there and blow the whole thing up. I mean work out that the current system is what is supporting the current lack of diversity and lack of inclusion. And unless you disassemble the current system, you cannot create one that is more diverse and more inclusive. So that brings me to a couple of topics that I want to talk about. One is recruitment reform. Some of you will have seen my posts on LinkedIn and gone, wow, she is cranky, and I'm going to get to that point. I want to talk about contrarian thinking later on, but right now I'm going to talk about recruiting reform. No, I'm not cranky. I'm definitely not cranky. I'm not disappointed. I fully understand what is behind the present recruiting structures that exist. And it reflects a much greater situation in our society. You know, the neoliberal approach to government is very similar to what we're seeing in corporations, you know. And while I'm a political scientist and I don't want to say one system is better than another, what I will say to you is that the present situation in organizations is one that doesn't respect diversity at all. There are programs, diversity programs, but they don't impact the structure of organizations, and they don't impact the organization's thinking when it comes to how it goes about structuring itself. One of the things that I notice is that when you go to a startup, when you have an entrepreneurial style of business. Now, I am actually head of a number of startups, and they're quite small, I will admit, but they are startups. And I've long been a contrarian and entrepreneurial thinker. So let's examine that for a little bit. What do I mean by contrarian? Now, I don't mean necessarily somebody who's difficult. I mean somebody who thinks differently to the way that most of you think. So in other words, contrary to the way most people think. And I want to talk about that contrarian thinking in a way that it might inform recruiting right now in this particular time. And I want to put an entrepreneurial or innovation lens to that. You see, innovation comes from different ways of thinking, contrarian ways of thinking. Innovation comes from people who look for opportunity in every threat, who look for opportunity in every change. Right now, we have a situation where a huge percentage of our population is now entering the realms of the long-term unemployed, myself included. And I can only speak about myself specifically, so I'll do that right now. Throughout my life, I've never been unemployed for more than 2 weeks. And that happened in my 20s when a friend and I, hi Kevin, decided that we would actually take some time off when we both found ourselves out of a job to go to his little shack on the beach and spend our times living off seafood for 2 weeks. And we took, we had kerosene refrigerators and all those kinds of things. And it was a great time. And by the end of the 2 weeks, we'd all had enough and we went back and we found jobs. At that time, I was a chemist, an industrial chemist, if you like. And Kevin was a boilermaker. And that's as long as I've been unemployed my entire life. What is more, I've hardly applied for a job in my life. What happened was in 1979 I applied for 31 different positions in a sugar mill laboratory because it was the first time that I'd ever applied for a real job. I'd had jobs running supermarkets, running little supermarkets. I'd had jobs, being a kind of rouseabout in a store. I'd had jobs opening a supermarket on weekends and running that, a service station on weekends and running that service station for the weekend. I'd had all these jobs, between the ages of 13 and sort of 16. When I went off to tertiary studies for the first time in 1979, my studies involved me studying for 20 odd weeks, 22 I think it was, and then coming back and doing a stint of about 20 weeks in a laboratory, and then going to your second year and then doing another 20 weeks in a laboratory in the Australian sugar industry. So in that period of time, I would go from one job to the next job and be promoted through the process. And then ultimately, I decided that I would head off and do something different for a little while, as most 20-somethings do. And I became a photojournalist. I had had a long history of working for my newspapers and various other publications doing photography. My father had built me a darkroom under the house, a typical Queenslander style house. And so I went off to Nicaragua. I had never been more than 400 kilometres from my hometown in Queensland, and I jetted off to Nicaragua, and I ended up over there covering the troubles that were happening during the Reagan administration and the Oliver North Contra troubles. I won't get into the detail of that. I'll come back to Australia. I came back to Australia. I worked for a little while as a photojournalist, freelancing, covering cycling events and so on, and decided I'd go off cycling around New Zealand. So again, took some time off, but elected time off. And I did that, and then I came back to Australia and literally stepped on my parents' doorstep, and when I arrived there was a gentleman standing there who said, I'm looking for a chemist and I hear you have the knowledge on skills I'm looking for. So he asked me a bunch of questions, and this is how the job interview went. It kind of went, so how long have you been a chemist for? And I said, X number of years. Have you done this type of analysis? Yes, I have. Have you done that type of analysis? Yes. Have you done this type of analysis? No, I haven't, but I know how to do it. And that was how job interviews went, right? So this is the production superintendent for a sugar mill interviewing me on the stairs of my parents' home. I didn't apply for the job. He just came and he interviewed me because I'd been recommended. That pattern went through my entire life, sans the interview. I'd be working on a project, Australian Institute of Marine Science will come in and say, we like the way you work and think, come do this with us. Betts Laboratories would come in and say, we like the way you think, you want to come and work for us. In fact, Betts Laboratories chased me for 2 years and I didn't want a sales role, a technical sales role. So I said no. Ultimately, they came up with a role that suited me and I went off to there. I ended up being the account manager for North East Queensland for GE Water and Process Technologies. So the point is, I'd almost never applied for a job. I'd certainly not written an application for a job any time that I can recall. So I ended up working for NQ Dry Tropics, running a number of programs as senior project officer under the Reef program, which was, I think initially 50 million, ended up something like $235 million. And those projects were to protect the Great Barrier Reef from the impacts of farming. Now, what I didn't tell you was when I worked for the Australian Institute of Marine Science, we'd published research into the effects of aquaculture effluent on mangrove ecosystems, first of its kind study, which went on to inform the use of algae for stripping nutrients from water and the creation of biofuels. And the paper is still cited today. And I can tell you, even post-transition, if I went on to any aquaculture facility in Australia and said my birth name, they would know who I was. In fact, I've had that happen. So, the point I'm trying to make here is that there are lots of people who find themselves now unemployed who have zero experience of writing CVs and cover letters. Some of us, myself included, have had $2,000 worth of professional help, the value of which is questionable, to help us to write our CVs and cover letters. But that's about all we've had. We're not that experienced at it. And the reason we're not experienced at it is because we have never had to do it. And the reason we've never had to do it is because we were talented enough that we didn't have to. So, now to your recruitment processes. I had a recruiter say to me the other day, for an organisation that's an award winner in LGBTI inclusion, say to me the other day that she barely has a couple of minutes to spend trying to look at each CV to, if you like, filter out the candidates. Therein lies your problem. Everybody else is in exactly the same boat. This is COVID-19. Million people or more are unemployed, probably several million people are unemployed who've never been unemployed before, and you think you're going to select your best candidates by using the recruitment processes that you've used before, but just do them faster. Anybody else see a problem? Because I, as a contrarian thinker, I, as an innovative thinker, I, as an entrepreneurial thinker, would say, hang on a minute, this is a massive opportunity. There are a stack of really talented people who would have never ever lost their jobs, who would never ever apply for a job, people who wouldn't have the first clue of how to apply for a job in amongst all these CVs. My goal is to find those golden nuggets I cannot believe that nobody is thinking like that. I'm yet to encounter anybody who's thinking like that. I really, really am. So, hey, this is the power of diverse people. This is the power of employing people who think differently to you. This is the power of diverse lived experience. This is the power of diversity of thinking. This is the power of neurodiversity. Your diversity and inclusion programs aren't about cupcakes on Wear It Purple Day. They're about how do you leverage the diversity of lived experience that has not been able to get through the barriers that you've put in place without even understanding what those barriers are. You need people with that diverse lived experience to tell you what the barriers are. And back to the subject now of a previous employer, which I'm not going to name, but I'm going to talk about how am I in this situation. So I did some, really fabulous work that I was incredibly excited about with a previous employer. And my manager at the time went to the director of the department that I was working in and said, I don't care what happens, Kimberly is not leaving. I wish I'd never heard that because it probably shaped my thinking a little bit. That director ended up leaving anyway. But the point of this is that my talents had been recognised by a leader who I respected incredibly well as one of the most talented leaders I ever met. She and I had shared at a number of conferences that we both felt imposter syndrome, and that in fact she was scared to hire me. One, because she wasn't sure she could support a trans woman. She had no experience of that diversity. But also because she was scared that she might actually find me threatening because, in her words, you're clearly very smart. Despite that, she hired me. And again, it was one of those interviews. What do you know about app development? I know it's expensive, I replied. So what I would do to control those expenses is this. Now, most organisations that I'm dealing with right now would not hire me based on that response. Oh, you know nothing about app development. Well, I do now. I've developed 3 since. Okay. Diversity of thinking. Anyway, I'm digressing again. When my contract came to an end, it seemed clear to me that I wasn't going to be further employed. As it turned out, I was for a little while, but it was clear to me that this was going to end with me being unemployed. Now, I clearly wanted to stay with a really good manager, and I clearly wanted to stay with an organisation that I thought was doing good work. It was a values alignment piece, something I've talked about many times. I informed this organisation that what they weren't aware of is that if I lost that job, that is highly likely that I would never get another. You might think I'm overstating that, but here I am, 3,400 job applications, and 19 months later from when I first started applying for jobs because I was fearful that my contract would end and I wouldn't be able to get a job. In fact, before COVID-19 hit, I'd already applied for 2,800 jobs, and that was the point at which I told them that if I lose this job, I will never get another. That's what I fear. Or if I get another, it will be a role in which I can't really flourish. It will be a role below my skill set, and it will be a role that will kind of threaten my existence. Bear in mind, I went completely broke in 2014. I came to Sydney homeless with $400, 3 dresses, 1 pair of shoes. I had barely any superannuation because I was self-employed for 12 years. So having a job is really important to me, and I informed them that it's highly likely that I will struggle to find a job. They didn't believe that. I know they didn't believe that. I believe they didn't believe it because they were well-meaning and their values align with mine, and I'm sure that they would not have elected to take the action they took if they believed what I told them. But that is the same thing as the colour blindness that is expressed when people say, I don't see colour, to a black person. What you're saying by that is, I don't see your disadvantage. Now, I am certain they didn't see my disadvantage. I'd done award-winning work with them. I'd shown them that I had these incredible skills. I'd shown them that I was a thinker. They got me to create policies and frameworks and strategies that weren't even in my remit because they couldn't get anybody else to do the thought experiment involved. But by saying or thinking, I don't believe that you won't ever get a job or that you will struggle to get a job, is a belief that you know better about my lived experience than I do. It's the colour blindness that says, I don't see colour. It's the disadvantage blindness that says, I don't see disadvantage. I don't see your disadvantage. So, welcome those contrarian thinkers. Contrarian thinkers are like nuclear fission. This is the analogy that I like to use. Even people who you might describe as difficult, and that description actually means they don't fit my way of thinking. They think differently to me and act differently to me. Those contrarian thinkers are the diversity that you want. They're the nuclear fission of the workplace world. They're the analogy of the energy that's required to power entrepreneurship and innovation. Now, go back to 1950s United States and forget for the moment that the toxic waste products of atomic energy, and just think about atomic energy's potential as it was seen back then. This is something that's incredibly powerful, massively powerful, and built some of the most destructive devices ever used in warfare. But, harnessed, it's incredibly useful. It's the same thing with contrarian thinkers. It's the same thing with difference of diversity in thought. It's the same thing with neurodiversity. And what's required is brilliant leaders, the kind of leader that I talked about before. Those leaders are the control rods of the nuclear furnace. They're the control rods of the nuclear reactor. They're the moderators of the nuclear fission. They allow the process to happen at a rate that's controllable. Don't dispose of your contrarian thinkers. Don't dispose of those people who think differently to you. Harness their thinking. What is the control rod for that nuclear fission analogy in the workplace? Mentorship, 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 mentorship. Both mentor your diversity and have your diversity mentor you. I'm Kimberly Olsen. This is The View From Here.